Welcome to the balance sheet where you rise above the noise and learn about the most important business issues of our age. I'm your host and fellow student, Conrad Chua. It's almost becoming a cliche that we're living in uncertain times. Companies just don't know what's around the corner anymore. So, how do CEOs make sense of what's going on? What can they do to help prepare their companies to ride through uncertainty and get those opportunities? Are the things we learned in business school strategy courses still relevant? To help us understand all this, we have Vignesh Chandran. Vignesh is a growth expert who's worked with CEOs to translate transformational strategies into reality. He's advised clients in a wide range of sectors, including technology, retail, pharma, automotive, property, and consumer goods. Vignesh is starting his second consultancy firm. The consultancy that he first co-founded helped clients on leveraging AI and machine learning, and his expertise extends across pricing, sales and marketing, customer lifetime value, and data platforms. So, welcome, Vignesh.
Thank you, Conrad. Thanks for having me here.
Vignesh, what are the steps that a CEO should take to identify and adapt to the disruptive changes in their industry?
So I think change has been there as far back as businesses have existed. Some of the interesting developments we're reading in the market is actually nothing's quite new. We've probably seen versions of it in the past. I think in my view, good businesses do three things, and they do those three things very well. I think the first is to be connected into the market and understand the needs and changes that are happening in the market. The second thing they do well is they chart a very clear strategy on where they will play and why they will play over there. And focus on customers. And this is the bit that sets them apart. And then the third bit is execution excellence, where they have a clear view of how they're going to execute their plan and adapt and embrace it with changing tides. I made that sound very simple. Although if you open the front page of the Financial Times every single morning, you'd see it's riddled with companies that miss the mark on these three key aspects. And you've got some of the most talented people at the head of these businesses. So why is this? I think the world is changing at an incredible pace, as you introduced this session. But I think the most interesting aspect is market dominance and the moat that businesses used to have around what they do is no longer as defendable. Companies can be toppled in less than a year. I think case in point is the rise of Nvidia's market cap, which is now $2.3 trillion, and that's a 400% rise in less than a year, and that's significant. That's iconic. I think OpenAI is probably in the lips of most of the viewers on this live stream. So market dominance is less defendable, and it's probably going to be that way. What is the superpower that a CEO should bring to driving their business? I think it is being future ready, and my current consultancy is actually built on this ethos. How do you build future ready businesses that are relevant in the future for customers, colleagues, shareholders, stakeholders, all of them? And I think future ready businesses will be quite an interesting theme to explore as we go through the next few minutes.
Cool. Just a reminder to the viewers, you can put your questions in the chat or comments. We may not answer the questions in order, and we have a few people joining in. Jan, who used to teach at the business school, now in Amsterdam. Samantha, New York. Nicholas in Colorado. Quinn from Texas. Nurlan from Paris, and others. So please, thank you so much, and please put questions that you have about strategy and about disruption in the chats. Vignesh, what are some of the features of a future-ready organization?
Okay. I think it's probably worth bringing one of the frameworks that we earlier discussed on the screen. But as I touched on, there's three things that we usually think of, that drive the economic flywheel of any business. And if at the heart of what a good business has is to drive value, and there's three parts to it. One is trying to look at disruptions and trying to understand and calibrate what exactly that means to your business. And I think with changing markets, trying to understand that is going to be quite important. The second and the third we touched on earlier, which is strategy and execution. I think the interesting bit about strategy is the agility that is required. The days of the 5-year strategy that is written down, revised once in a year, or the 3-year plans are becoming less and less relevant. What you need is something which is very agile, that helps businesses anchor themselves on a path, but is constantly able to move and see what is happening. And when it comes to delivery, again, trying to have a different way of making decisions and moving at pace, experimenting to try to find success are some interesting aspects. But what then you need to do is to get this economic flywheel to gather momentum, because at the heart of most organizations are people. And I think this is where there are, in my view, three further aspects that businesses need to think about when they think about how do they drive all of this activity with change. And none of these words are new, perhaps, to most CEOs. And there are several books that have been written about it. The first of which is what is how do you be a business that always thinks about innovation. And that's the first lever, and it's probably the most most profound for businesses to reinvent themselves. The second one is an overused word when you talk about change. It's called transformation. But when I think about transformation, I think about transformation with a little t, which is trying to make several small bets rather than one big bet, in 2 to 3 years' time. And then the third aspect of that is what I called venture building. And if we talked about what is so asynchronous and not quite in the DNA of a large business, I think it's probably venture building. The number of times you hear very small entrepreneurs come together without any capital, but with a great idea, and then to drive the economic flywheel forward and build great businesses, is very interesting. And why wouldn't large businesses with far more better access to capital, far more better access to clients, and far more better resources at their disposal and ideas, actually, why aren't they able to build great ventures that helps them to constantly innovate on their S curves? And I think that's a competitive advantage of its own. So I think that's what a future-ready organization looks like for me, to try to think about these different aspects and think about where competitive advantage will come from.
Vignesh, right now we have access to so much information and data. I can imagine all of this coming into the boardroom, to the CEO's office, but in a way that increases the amount of noise. So the first step is, how can a CEO or a leadership team distinguish that what's noise and what's signal, to be able to figure out what is the business that they want to create.
Yeah, and I think that's is a great question, because you could, when you talk about some of these topics, given that they are so future forward, you could be pulled in, from pillar to post, where there's news about blockchain, there's news about large language models, and suddenly you could be, hard lefting, or turning hard right, and that's important to try to build a culture of being able to experiment, learn, analyze, and know what your strengths are, know where your broader strategy is. So if I take an example of large language models, I you know we I'm right now advising an interesting business in the world of legal, where there's quite a lot of disruption happening. If you look at the legal profession, there's quite a lot of data which is in text format, which renders itself quite well to the use of large language models. And so, if there's a leader in that field, surely they should be taking note, if they haven't already, on how to deploy or explore interesting use cases, because the legal profession is probably going to be influenced quite profoundly. I read a paper a few days back on the recommendation of one of my friends in the Middle East, where there's an INSEAD research on could strategy be done with the help of large language models, and there was a experiment conducted where it showed perhaps you could get quite a lot of augmentation. In that instance, I think the key takeaway for a business leader is to not say, therefore, all our strategy is going to be done in 60 minutes and using a large language model, but is to say, how do we use this as a tool to try to do what we do differently, or what we do in a different context? So trying to understand the so what behind any technological disruption, any change that is happening in the market, any new business that is coming and eating into profits or market share, is probably the important facet that business leaders should think about.
And in this slide, you have this idea of defining your business, and isn't that quite straightforward? Isn't that what you enter a building in the company headquarters and you see that on the wall? What is the difficulty in terms of defining a business that's already there?
I think it's what I've observed in large organizations is there is a lot of corporate history in most businesses, and it has a lot of great people, which means you might have heard about how some organizations have a centralized motion, some others have much more decentralized. I think the world is, especially with what we've seen over the past decade, is moving more towards a federated model, but the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth with different businesses. But I think trying to understand how all of those different parts come together and align and contribute in the same direction is something that large organizations struggle with, and some organizations are better than others, but you could have over a long period of time a lot of different business models that have a lot of synergy that has been untapped. You could have a lot of areas where teams are working on the same ideas without collaboration. And you could be building a lot of complexity in your processes even without understanding what is happening. And that is that's kind of the transformation journey most businesses used to go on in the pre-digital era, when they would actually go in and try to re-engineer processes and try to get the organization to work with each other in an easy manner. I think with the world of digital, that has been enabled a bit more. But even then, you have complex architectures. You have systems that do not talk with each other. You have one part of the organization almost being able to talk with internal as well as external customers using APIs, and other parts left in the world of legacy. You can't automate workflows, etc. So the problems get replaced by newer problems, even when the world is so connected, so digital, etc. And that is where trying to constantly evolve a business with this multi-style of transformations, where we're not stagnating, knowing that things always have a shelf life and things are always moving, is going to be quite important. And that's what business building also means for me.
Yeah, of course, a CEO, there's so many demands on a CEO, right? And the CEO also has to look at the day-to-day, maybe week by week, quarter to quarter kind of operations. How does the CEO balance that kind of operation, looking at making sure that day-to-day operations move along, and with that kind of more long-term strategic objectives and transformation?
I think it's worth just touching on those two lanes. I think it's good. Most business leaders will need to think about running a good business that they have, as well as running a longer term path about reinventing themselves for the future. I think on the operations, innovation is an interesting angle. I think I advised a large global cybersecurity business in the S&P 500 a few years back, where we actually saw that they had quite a lot of talent, quite a lot of data. In fact, one of the most data-rich businesses I've worked with, but they weren't able to see the wood for the trees, and they weren't able to use that to drive better marketing return on investment. So this is despite having all the best talent they had, and quite a lot of profitability in the business. So in this instance, it was just the lack of strategic clarity of we've got these assets. How do we actually use those assets to drive better performance? And it became so if we talked about innovation in product, why do we actually limit our thinking to product innovation? Why didn't we actually apply it to process innovation, where we could be doing something smarter with the petabytes of data that we sit on? And we had this business to then think through those motions, and we ended up building a renewal pricing, given this is a technology business, and had subscription models. We helped them build a machine learning model that would do renewal pricing or renewal discounting in a varied manner to minimize customer churn, trying to understand the different behaviors of customers using the data they had, and trying to see if they were price sensitive because of the lack of a price elasticity curve, trying to understand the price sensitivity, and if they were price sensitive, trying to do pricing interventions in an automated manner. And for a business which had several millions of users, this was something which could never be done in a manual fashion. So it had to be done in automated fashion. So they even had the idea that they should be doing something to drive down customer churn, but they hadn't applied themselves to. So how do we actually create a loop with the data we have, the systems we have, and the people and talent we have, to bring it all together to do something differently over here to drive the business forward? So that's operationally a good example of you have everything, you have it in front of your eyes, but you haven't done anything about it. And very often it's not just the CEO, it's the leadership team around him and the leaders around them, and how they actually have clear drive-through of ideas, how they challenge each other, and make sure that they're constantly thinking about how to transform. On the longer slow burn one, I think this is where the idea of venture building is quite interesting to me. And and thinking about the future unencumbered is not natural. If and There are perhaps a few businesses that incubate great businesses outside. But in most cases, this is one of the most difficult things for businesses to do, because you are in effect saying, in 10 years' time, what we're doing will not be relevant, and therefore we need to do what we're doing differently. And most of the people have been hired to do the job in the current business, not in this business that does not exist, where there may be disruption coming up, and that's something which I think leaders with a lot of vision sometimes get done. There are various ways to make it happen. Perhaps one of which is to set up a venture arm where you incubate businesses at arm's length. But if there was a venture building capability where they were actually building, smarter things, greater ideas, almost like away from the core business, unencumbered by the same processes, by the same decision cycles, by the same speed, then you could have something quite interesting.
We've got a couple of questions, and I think some of them go into the topics the issues that you just mentioned. The first one I'll take is from Estefania on LinkedIn. How do you believe companies can effectively bridge the gap between developing strategic initiatives and obtaining direct customer interaction and feedback, especially when you're operating at a large scale?
I think those two things can't be done in isolation. You've got to being relevant is all about is mostly about being relevant for your customers. If you drew a business model picture, you start with who's your customer, what value are you creating for them. That's at the basic level. You need to know who they are, and if anything that you're doing as a strategic initiative, especially if that's still hitting the mark. What you're trying to do, though, is trying to make sure that while you achieve clarity of a new initiative, of something which maybe something different to how the current day works. Let's take an example. I think the whole world is on fire in terms of using large language models to start to reduce or change and transform customer experiences at different parts of the customer journey. If that's what you would like to do, trying to do that while you've got, and if you're an airline, while you've got several people traveling around the world without actually changing their lives or disrupting their journeys is going to be quite important. So the strategic initiative of trying to serve up to their needs in a different way and being a future-ready organization is also important, but you can't do it at the cost of the first business. And I think I read an example of a business in Northern America where they got into trouble by using a large language model, which made a poor recommendation, and it was then defended by the company. And trying to avoid things like that is going to be quite important, where you slowly test and build something enterprise grade, build something that is relevant for most businesses in the future, and then launching it. And now this isn't just in data and AI and technology, it's just a facet of it. I worked with a large retirement house builder a while back, where they just wanted to launch, instead of selling houses, they wanted to do rentals. And even that's a big change. If you're a house builder, you are building houses and selling them for profit. If you're a renter, you're a landlord, and you're regulated differently. You've got a different business model underpinning that. But you have profits recognition also differently. So there's an accounting angle to it. And then you've got a set of different entities. And trying to understand what that rental proposition is significantly different from your core model. You can't start renting houses in a specific parcel of land when sales incentives are perhaps geared more towards selling them. So thinking through the motions of you've got a great idea, but what is that doing to your current business, and trying to make sure that it is flowed through in a logical and a non-disruptive manner is all the more important. Sorry for the long response on that.
All right. Quinn has a question. I think following up on what you mentioned about venture building, right, and making small, rapid changes. What about M&A? A large organization has much more capital. Maybe they can stay relevant through acquiring a business with a specialized competitive advantage.
This is very relevant, and thanks, Gwen, for asking this. It's almost in my head the antithesis in terms of strategy. I think businesses grow organically and inorganically. I know several large businesses that actually pride themselves on their inorganic growth model to buy a business and integrate them in a non-disruptive manner, and in a way that actually makes 1 + 1 is 3 is something talked about. We've also read a lot of papers about sometimes that can be difficult. So doing that is great. But if you're doing especially synergistic buys, or if you're buying a business because that has a great technology or great set of customers that you would like to have, you are paying a premium in most cases to acquire them. Whereas you could almost see the business that you're buying is the business that you could have actually got through venture building yourselves, if you are constantly thinking about the future. And I think that's an interesting concept. Would you incubate a bunch of ideas that then become the business that you would have bought by paying a market premium? And I think they are non-exclusive, non-mutually exclusive strategies. Businesses need to always think about multiple ways to create value, especially if you're large. But I think it's an interesting concept that not all great ideas need to be bought, and trying to build great businesses that are almost challenging the core revenue streams and the core business model is something which is very difficult. If I may just take 2 more minutes, Conrad, I'd like to point an example. I worked with a services business a few years back, quite a large one, predominantly working in the UK, but also with some other markets, Middle East, and North America. Now, most of their revenues was in the contract, long-term annuity contracts or long-term services contracts. One of the MDs of that business had an interesting idea about trying to leverage a platform business model and use platform fees as an alternative to large contracts. There are 2 reasons that is interesting. One is the profitability profile is completely different. Number 2 is instead of getting money from one single party in the entire transaction, you actually could monetize every single part of the platform, multiple sides of it. And that meant you had more revenues, definitely more profitability, but it's something which the business has never, ever done. There's a great example of a venture building that did not take off because the business tried to apply some of their current practices to evaluate and then fund and drive that business. At which point, I think after a few years, they decided that it wasn't worth pursuing it. But if it was done differently and if it was set separately, there was a very robust business case, and that's a business that perhaps would have actually taken quite a lot of their market share, and in the M&A context would have been one they would have to acquire to build back in-house.
I'd be interested to ask you to clarify what you meant by M&A is the antithesis of strategy, if we have time later on. But we have
in terms of venture building, sorry.
Oh, to venture building, okay. So Edward asked, how do we track the long-term effects of strategic changes on our customer base? And maybe I'd reframe that to ask, as senior leaders think about strategic change, should they start by think of how they're going to measure that impact of that change and be able to adjust as they go on, even before they launch it?
You could have a you could have a calculated view of what impact changes if you are if I'll just pick an example, if you're a property developer that sells houses through a on-site sales force, trying to do that differently, or if you are a SaaS business and suddenly start using your digital network to start making different revenue streams. I think you will have to constantly measure the long-term effects of some of these strategic changes. I don't know if there is a silver bullet to try to predict or understand them before it happens. This is why I think there was an earlier question on how do you actually make sure that you don't estrange customers or take feedback. I think that's a constant process. The bit that most technology native businesses have done well is to get constant feedback. And some of the neobanks that have disrupted the financial services industry have done that by actually constantly taking customer feedback. And I used a neobank app, and yesterday it was interesting that this is one of the largest in Europe, but even they had a bug that was actually preventing a specific transaction from going through on the business banking app. And they fixed it within a matter of, I think, 3 hours with constant updates. But they've learned that that had an impact. That was a slightly different transaction that they wouldn't have probably matured. It's a new kind of feature, but they've introduced it. They're learning quickly from it, and they're actually fixing it, making sure the customer is not impacted negatively by that, and trying to do interesting, very, very fast, rapid learning loops, but also innovating constantly and keeping close with the customers is the only thing. There's no secret other than that, in my view.
And that leads on to a question from Ing Muhammad on LinkedIn. So how can innovation as a process be successfully embedded in an organization?
I think there's a lot written on how to, what does an innovation, ideation, moving from concept to market look like, and there are different mental models that people use to try to understand, as well as quite scientific models to evaluate things quite well. So in the consumer goods world, where I did quite a lot of new product development, innovation evaluation. Innovation is very different in the world of consumer goods, where you're constantly looking for incremental revenues and profits from extending products, which are called line extensions, but also suddenly introducing a new brand, etc. And I think every organization needs to establish what that cadence is. But the most interesting disruption for consumer goods, came from actually the digital and the e-com world, where I think or interesting businesses with an interesting view. Ben and Jerry's is a good example of ice cream. With a quirky side, and being a B Corp actually interests customers, rather than just great ice cream that Unilever always used to have and still does. Similarly, you could, I think it was the $1 Shave Club, which completely disrupted Gillette. And actually, Gillette is probably one of the most innovative organizations when it comes to launching new products and getting incremental revenues off. So I think organizations need to think about what the innovation process looks like, and how does it actually embrace disruption from the market, and when it happens, how will it react? And that's I think an evolving topic.
And we have a question from Samantha. Samantha asks, as organizations prepare to be future ready by looking at disruptions, devising strategies, and adapting, how can CEOs and leadership teams ensure that their teams are also ready? What would be a critical step to ensure that people are bought in and are ready to support that organizational transformation?
Yeah. I think this is quite interesting. So if you look at the term, the duration that CEOs have, I think historically it's started to shrink quite rapidly. So if you're the boss, you've got very little time to come in and have an impact on the organization, and therefore you would think you've got very little time to actually make an impact. So what would you like to do? You wouldn't like the numbers to go wrong. You wouldn't like the results to come out, especially if you're a listed business, to come out in anything other than positive in the view of analysts, and stock price remaining stable, and all of that. So how do you actually do some of these quite bold moves for organizations, but at the same time not lose your people, is quite an interesting one, and it's something. I think having a learning culture, having an organization that thinks about empowering people, but also getting ideas, encouraging ideas from different parts, and getting them constantly learning about new things and pushing the bar and pushing the boundaries is going to be quite important, because although leadership tenure is shrinking, the rate of change is increasing, and if to stay relevant in the future, you'd have to almost look into what people say is the looking glass and see what's coming and prepare yourself for that, prepare your people for that, and the days of trying to run big transformations when a new CEO comes into power to move the deck chairs around, run process re-engineering, or install new systems and say that would solve all of our problems, is gone. I think it's much more pervasive across the organization, getting people to contribute in several ways, and trying to have a healthy organization is a very long-term process, and CEOs need to think quite deeply about that with their leadership teams, of course.
We have a question from Mustafa on LinkedIn, and I somehow can't seem to make it show, but Mustafa asks, do you think customers would be more excited about strategic transformation as a clear, focus, and distinct disciplined process rather than change. And Mustafa says change kind of brings about this idea that customers are in the passenger seat or driving seat, and they're not just a partner for the journey, but they're really driving that process.
Yeah. So when I started my career as a consultant, I used to work in a lot of change programs, and the first one was a post-merger integration of a very large business, where there were several consultants running around, and lots of targets set. It was highly visible in the market. There was a big cost synergy to be delivered. The city was waiting for it. The numbers depended on it. It was a very different kind of experience, I thought, between what driving change in an organization should look like and what it actually looked like. And I think that word, when people think about change, they think about it's actually a program of work, and it hits an organization. It's hot, and you need a lot of external support to go and support it. All the change that is happening to the people, etc. I think that's becoming more and more obsolete in my view. Some of the words that you've used there, Mustafa, of being clear, focused, and disciplined, and being constantly evolving, is the way organizations need to be. And the way you do that is by trying to experiment constantly, trying to do a lot of what I call bet small and bet often, rather than bet big and bet seldom. And trying to constantly be a learning organization where you are doing something. If with all that news about large language model, if you're not having a team of people actually sticking and prodding it and trying to find use cases where you could deploy it, you are missing a trick. If you're a SaaS business sitting on a ton of data, should be thinking about what is the value of that data. If you're a business, in the legal profession, and you see quite a lot of movement, I guess there's a question on what is likely to happen to the professional services world, where people are always charging time for money. And what would the implications be if that wasn't the case? So thinking about all of those things is important. And the more you do that, the more customers will see that as a positive rather than anything which has a negative connotation, because you're constantly doing a lot of moves and experiments and changing yourself to stay relevant for the customer and to almost anticipate their needs rather than be following through once customers have expressed dissatisfaction with the current state.
We have only 1 or 2 minutes left, so I will have the last question. Vignesh, you did an MBA almost 10 years ago now, and if you look back on your experience, what do you think is the most important lesson that you've learned about strategy that maybe is kind of under-taught in many business schools' strategy courses?
Strategy was one of the most liked courses in Cambridge when I was there. I think the great ideas exist everywhere. Getting it done is where most of the difficulty lies, is the message I learned over the past decade. And I think there's no dearth of smart people in large businesses, and most would go to great school like Cambridge or Oxford or one of those other Ivy League schools in the US. But it's then, how do you take those ideas? How do you navigate the organization, work with people to have impact where a lot of learning then follows through?
Well, thank you so much, Vignesh, for reminding us that ultimately a company is measured on getting things done and not just on the number of PowerPoint slides that are presented. To our viewers, thank you so much for giving us your time and for your questions. If you like the show, please repost it on your social networks. And the balance sheet will be back next week, 15th of March. We have Professor Elroy Dimson, who will bring us through a project that he's been doing, he and some other co-authors have been doing for several decades now, which is the Global Investment Returns Handbook. So till then, stay well, and we'll see you next time.